Good afternoon. This is Francesco Barbera with Barbera Corporate Law. I'm very pleased to be here with John Montgomery. And John is a longtime Silicon Valley startup lawyer, started his own firm and practiced in Silicon Valley representing startup and growth companies, private and public, for, I think, what, John, like 30 years or so?
Well, it's been
more?
Since 1984. It's 35 years. I don't know
Yep.
where they went. It's a long time.
Yeah, and more recently, John has segued into, John was instrumental in bringing benefit corporations into the state of California, and he's played a significant role in advancing the benefit corporation corporate form nationally and in California. And so they're a real honor to have him here to speak to us about mission-driven entrepreneurship, building the next generation of companies that are doing business differently, and the role that benefit corporations have to play in evolving capitalism to a model that is more sustainable and that brings benefits, distributes benefits more equally across the spectrum, let's say. So, John, maybe a good place to start would be if you could share more about your career, in particular your work as a lawyer, and then your more recent evolution and transition, and what you're up to these days.
Sure. Well, I'm a very lucky guy. I had an absolutely fabulous career in Silicon Valley. I represented about 1,000 startups, 25 public companies. I loved the constant variety of different technologies, different management teams, different founding teams. And for a fellow with a short attention span, I found a really creative niche in the law working with entrepreneurs, because there was constant variety in my life. I got to work with semiconductors, hardware, medical devices, life sciences, software, solar, clean energy. It was fantastic. And along the way, however, especially in the 90s, when my semiconductor clients started moving fabs and operations to China, I started feeling very uncomfortable, because all of a sudden we were putting people out of work in this country to move factories to China, where we were employing people in labor conditions that were often illegal here, with environmental consequences of manufacture that would be illegal here. And often the company would have to bribe the Chinese government through a consultant to keep electricity running to the factory in violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And people would feel uncomfortable in the boardroom talking about this stuff, but they sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, or, we have to, we have no choice. We have to, as a director, we have to maximize, stockholder profits, stockholder welfare. And I started feeling a lot of dissonance about how the corporation was set up. And my fundamental question was, how come relatively good people like me and my directors, who tend to follow the golden rule in our private lives, how come we get in the boardroom and the rule of gold takes over? And it felt to me like we had two parallel ethical systems running in America. As an individual, we're kind of inheritors of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we're supposed to abide by Judeo-Christian ethics and morality, but the corporation itself gets a hall pass from that, because its sole purpose under Delaware law is to maximize stockholder welfare. And that is the moral compass that ultimately guides corporate behavior. And the more I got into the history of the corporation and how it came to lack a conscience, the more I set out to do something about it. I started tinkering with the articles and bylaws of corporations headed by socially responsible entrepreneurs And then I was introduced to the leaders of the benefit corporation movement or idea back then in 2008 or 9, and got involved in helping to draft the benefit corporation legislation. And once I got infected with the benefit corporation, which, unlike the traditional corporation, which is prone to sociopathic, antisocial, unethical, and even criminal behavior, the benefit corporation reverses the lobotomy of the traditional corporation and begins to render it prone to altruistic behavior. And once I saw how unwittingly the corporation that we all know and love, that populates the entire global economic system, is a 500-year-old construct that's unwittingly and unintentionally prone to sociopathic behavior, I was no longer content with the status quo. I couldn't sit by and be a card-carrying member of an economic system that, you know, is itself prone to sociopathic, unethical, amoral, and even criminal behavior. So I became infected with the benefit corporation meme.
So it's interesting the way that you, I mean, because it's, you know, like what you talked about, what you're saying is you got a bunch of good people. They're in business. They get put in charge of these companies, and because of the underlying legal regime, their job description requires them to place the interests of the shareholders above the interests of others that might be impacted. And so there's this structural mandate, essentially, in favor of what you're calling sociopathic behavior, which is a pretty strong term. So why do you use that term in particular? Well,
here's the interesting thing. Because in my observation, especially with our public companies, what happens is this design flaw, this requirement that the sole legitimate purpose of the Delaware Corporation is to maximize stockholder welfare, really doesn't make that much difference for the majority of our corporations, which are privately held and small. And, you know, if you're a family business, or if you're a business that's owned by a few shareholders who are friends, you can run that business in a way that reflects your values. So there's synchronicity between your own moral system and the way you can run that company. The minute, however, that you bring in venture capital or private equity, the game changes, because those investors are fiduciaries. They have limited partners to whom they have promised a rate of return that's greater than the S&P 500. And they're investing in you not because of your values and how you're running the company. They're investing in you because they want to make money. And you have an obligation to them, which they will often enforce, to maximize stockholder welfare. And the situation gets worse once you get into the public market, because all of a sudden you're a public company and you've got to answer to the street every quarter. And the street is relentless. You know, are your earnings per share increasing? Are your profits per share increasing? You know, what have you done for us lately? It's all about the bottom line. And you know, what does the street value? The street doesn't value, you know, ethics and morality, and you know, they value results, the bottom line. And so the, you know, it's a very subtle thing, and it means that you know, we're constantly tempted to optimize profit at the expense of society and the environment. And we've normalized the process in the accounting system of externalizing as many of the negative costs and consequences of corporate behavior onto society and the environment as we can legally get away with. And that's the game globally. So that's why, that's why the system itself and the corporation, especially as it gets closer and closer to being a public company and has more and more private equity and venture capital investors, gets more and more prone to amoral, unethical, antisocial, sociopathic behavior, because the temptation is to optimize behavior for profit at the expense of society and the environment. And that's often what happens.
Now, there are, I mean, that, it's kind of perverse. Like what you're saying is the more wealthy and powerful corporations become, the stronger the structural incentives are for it to behave in a self-interested manner, in a sense, which is troubling. If we're set up a system that works this way, it's not surprising that we're seeing some structural problems, right?
Yeah. And again, nobody's to blame. I
right.
love corporations. As I said at the beginning of this interview, I had a fantastic career. I represented some really amazing companies. It was a blast. I loved being a corporate lawyer, and I loved
Yep.
working for these collective life forms. But I came to believe that the corporation itself has not evolved in 500 years. Could
right.
we sail from Europe to the United States on replicas of the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria? Absolutely. That technology is still viable, but most likely we're going to go to SFO and hop on a United flight to Munich if we want to go to Europe and use 21st century technology. Essentially, the corporation is a 14th or 15th century construct that has not evolved. It was designed
right.
for the age of empire as an agent of empire for
Yeah.
the king to use quasi-military forces to conquer foreign territory for the crown and exploit it for the royal treasury. And that's what the corporation was designed to do. Its fundamental design hasn't changed in 500 years. It was not designed to have a social and environmental conscience. And to the extent it had one, it was external in the king. And you know what happened in the American Revolution? We got rid of the king, but we never replaced the conscience mechanism. There were only 50 corporations at the time of the American Revolution in the US, and the founding fathers didn't think about them. And so we got rid of the external conscience function of the king. That evolved into the legislature. And when New York invented free incorporation and limited liability in 1811, which inventions, swept the global economic system and are standard everywhere, we eliminated the external conscience function entirely. So, we've created these collective life forms that have no conscience. And of course they're prone to sociopathic and immoral and unethical behavior because they're focused on one thing and one thing alone, and that's maximizing stockholder welfare.
Yeah. So let's shift gears to, okay, you're a mission-driven entrepreneur, and and there are so many entrepreneurs these days that are really looking at their businesses as a vehicle for positive impact, positive transformation. There are social enterprises that are looking to tackle some big problems using business and so forth, and they're wanting to use entrepreneurship as a vehicle for changing the status quo that you're describing, and having the business sector be part of the solution, so to speak. And for entrepreneurs like that, what are the tools available to them, that you've used as a corporate lawyer to help them bake their mission into the legal structures of their company. And, related to that is, how do you think the benefit corporation itself solves the problem of, solve this problem of the lack of conscience among corporations?
Sure. Well, the benefit corporation, is a dual purpose for-profit entity. So in addition to the traditional purpose of the corporation to optimize profit for shareholders, the benefit corporation, under Delaware has an additional purpose of operating in a responsible and sustainable manner. And in most states that have adopted the model benefit corporation legislation, the dual purpose is to create a material positive impact on society and the environment from the operations of the corporation taken as a whole. So there's a second purpose of creating a public benefit, operating for the benefit of society and the environment, that takes away any doubt that someone who's operating a business this way is somehow breaching their fiduciary duties to shareholders. Because in a traditional corporation, the fiduciary duties of the directors flow only to shareholders. Whereas in benefit entities, they flow to all of the corporation stakeholders, society and the environment, employees, vendors and suppliers, the community in which the company does business. So it's a multiple stakeholder model in addition. So you've got a dual purpose, multiple stakeholder business model that gives a mission-driven entrepreneur protection to bake his or her mission into the charter and substantiates the exercise of his fiduciary responsibilities to society and the environment. So, again, you have a corporate vehicle that is prone to altruistic behavior rather than sociopathic behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, I think, to kind of underscore the legal status of this second purpose and the stakeholder model under the statute, because it's probably, I would imagine it's not that easy for a layperson to kind of like understand the kinds of legal pressure that corporate directors and officers operate under. But I view the benefit corporation as really fundamentally like changing the job description of someone that's sitting on a board of directors. So in a traditional corporation, if I take that job, it's my understanding that I'm working for the shareholders and my job is to maximize their return. And to the extent that I'm always evaluating my decisions through that lens, and to the extent that I'm exercising business discretion, on the margins, I'm kind of looking over my shoulders. And there's at a certain point, especially in change of control contexts, and where you're operating on pretty shaky ground. Unless you're really focused on the shareholders. But with a benefit corp, the statute itself makes it very, very clear that my job is very different. And my job is, as a legal matter, my legal obligations are to balance the impacts of the company's actions, to balance profit maximization with public benefit and the impact of the company's actions on stakeholders. And there's that holistic decision making that's legally mandated, and therefore it has the force of law behind it, which is pretty radical, if you ask me. I mean, it's a pretty radical step. It's a pretty radical change. Would you say it's a radical change?
It is a radical change. There's no question. I liken it to juggling. In a traditional corporation, directors have it easy. They only have to juggle one ball.
Right.
Maximize. It does this decision that we're about to make fulfill our duty to maximize stockholder welfare. Yes or no? It's pretty easy. With a benefit corporation, you got to juggle three balls. You got that ball that you're familiar with, you know, which is, okay, am I taking care of my shareholders? And you got to juggle that with two other balls. Am I, you know, under the model benefit corporation legislation, am I, you know, optimizing the positive impact of my decision on society and the environment? And society, you know, and the environment break down into, you know, various stakeholders. There's society, the communities in which we do business, employees, vendors and suppliers, you know, et cetera. And decisions get much more nuanced and much more complicated. And there's, you know, often there's no right answer. It's like those law review questions or the bar exam questions. You know, here's 4 answers, they're all right. Pick the one that's most right. You know, so it, you know, directors like the yes or no, where it's black and white. Where when you have to juggle 3 balls like that, decisions are much more nuanced. Now you're protected by the business judgment rule, but it's a completely new way of thinking about business. And it expands the moral compass of that business to be much more comprehensive. So all of a sudden, you know, if you're somebody that's operating in your private life through the golden rule, all of a sudden the benefit corporation authorizes you as a director to run your company essentially with the same moral compass, because you've got to balance the effect of your decision on all of your stakeholders.
Yeah, which is something that we, as human beings, we do that naturally all day long in every other context in our life. I mean, that's just how we live life. Is, you know, we don't walk around beating strangers that we walk by on the street, you know, or and whatnot. I mean, it's a very natural thing we're talking about, which is essentially, you know, be guided by your conscience as it, and there may be no hard and fast rules, but, you know, we kind of, you know, have a general sense of things. I mean, what I do know is that when I'm asked to think about something, you know, the mind will come up with new ideas, creative solutions, and possibilities, whereas under the current regime, directors aren't even asked or required, let alone required, to take that sort of holistic approach. So, I mean, I think a lot of the instinctive adverse response to benefit corporations is premised on this idea, like, well, it's all like touchy-feely, and like, how do you know this, you know, how do you make those judgments? Shouldn't we just let companies profit maximize and let consumers in the market sort out the wheat and the chaff, you know? And I don't know, I guess let me ask, you know, what is your response to that?
Well, I think that's a very common response. And I think, you know, we humans really don't like to change our behavior. And when we get comfortable with something, and I think the current corporate paradigm, we're all comfortable with it. You know, lawyers, accountants, board members, you know, we all know what we have to do. We got to maximize profit for shareholders. You know, it's really straightforward. But when we have to change our behavior and all of a sudden juggle 3 balls, hold on a second, we resist mightily. And what I've found really helps overcome the resistance is to just focus on the economic data. I like to bring up Robert Eccles' work at Harvard Business School. You know, Robert has spent his career studying the effects of the adoption of principles of sustainability on corporate performance, and he's tried to quantify it over, you know, a 30+ year period. And what he's found in his research is that businesses that adopt principles of sustainability, such as those embedded in the benefit corporation, provide 5 points IRR per annum greater return to investors than their conventional peers. And in addition, the economic data about multiple stakeholder models in books such as Profit for Life or Firms of Endearment show that businesses that adopt a multiple stakeholder philosophy where they try to add value to all stakeholders, not just shareholders, those businesses do far better than their conventional peers. So the reality is that at worst case, you won't do any worse than you would in a conventional corporation, but much of the economic data shows that doing business in this kind of a business model actually makes you more money if you're an investor. It's a better way of doing business. So I
what do you think what do you think is the and that's interesting. I think a lot of people would be surprised by that kind of data. And what is the causal mechanism by which a sustainable or multi-stakeholder approach would produce better business outcomes? I mean, wouldn't it kind of like increase costs and slow things down? And
well, I saw a presentation by the fellow that was running, I think, was it Stonyfield Farms? I think they ended up getting acquired. But anyway, when Stonyfield was an independent company, they were I think a benefit corporation and certified B Corp. And what they bought, organic milk from farmers, and they had to spend a lot of money and time educating farmers about organic processes and so on and so forth, so they had enough supply. But what they found, they spent a lot more money on the front end, and they paid higher prices for organic milk to make their cheese and yogurt and everything else. But on the back end, on the marketing, they had to spend, they spent virtually nothing on marketing because they got so much great PR from being a good guy, being an organic dairy. And so they actually ended up with higher profit margins by doing the right thing. And this is fairly common in these circles.
That's really interesting. We did this, the Firms of Endearment book was written by Raj Sisodia, who was a professor of marketing and founded Conscious Capitalism, or co-founded it with John Mackey, the head of Whole Foods. And Raj Sisodia was a marketing professor, and he noticed that there were companies that did not have to spend money on marketing, and he went about studying those companies to figure out what was going on in them and why they were able to achieve the outcomes that they were achieving without spending the kind of money on blasting the airwaves and all that. And what he found was this is exactly the difference. What you're pointing to is their culture, their way of doing things, their values, and all of these things that were like almost invisible to everybody. But when you looked inside at the heart of the company, this is what was going on that was leading to these wildly dedicated employees and consumers and fans that were just spreading the word. And that's how the book Firms of Endearment and ultimately the conscious capitalism movement kind of came about. Is like, how do we create more companies like this? And so that's interesting. I mean, it kind of, it reminds me, I think a lot of legacy business thinking is just based on a bunch of assumptions about how things are or how they need to be. And then the benefit corporation is kind of coming along and saying, no, there's another way. They don't need to be that way for us to have a functioning capitalistic system. But here's the thing, though, is, John, how has it been received? Are entrepreneurs having success with it? What's the status of the benefit corporation and the overall ecosystem right now? And And what's its prognosis, do you think, for the next 20 years?
Well, lawyers are not generally innovators, and corporate law tends to be pretty static. And in my view, the benefit corporation is the most significant innovation in corporate law since New York combined free incorporation and limited liability to create the limited liability corporation in 1811. And as far as adoption of legal forms is concerned, in my view, the benefit corporation is taking hold way too slowly. But in terms of legal innovations, it's going pretty fast. We have benefit corporation legislation in 35 states, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, the countries of Colombia, Italy, France, and British Columbia in Canada have adopted benefit corporation-like or inspired legislation. So it's going global. There are over 8,000 benefit entities in the US, and I say entities because 5 states now have benefit LLCs. And we have publicly traded benefit corporations in the US. So it's and that's in 9 years. Now, in my view, we've got, another 7 million corporations or so in America that are not benefit corporations. And, at the rate we're going, it'll take, decades before the benefit corporation is the vehicle of choice. So, I'm trying to take my game from, working one-to-one, converting one conventional corporation to a benefit corporation at a time, to figuring out a way of how we can scale knowledge of this new corporate form and have it adopted by the mainstream. And my belief is that, there are companies out there like Salesforce, where, I've had the good fortune of doing a bunch of executive coaching for the last 3 years. And that company, runs itself essentially like a benefit corporation. It does great things by society and the environment and provides a great return to its shareholders. And, my belief is that, a corporate leader like Mark Benioff is going to get wind of the benefit corporation and realize that if his corporation adopted it, his business would become the global thought leader in governance. And I think that's what, Emmanuel Faber of Danone is trying to do. He wants to be, the first multinational to have B Corp certification, which is probably the leading social and environmental impact assessment. So, my hope is that we get a core of significant multinational corporations that demonstrate to the herd that this really is a better way of doing business. Not only is it more, does it do the right thing, but it also does the right thing by shareholders, because, you have to spend less on marketing. And the other thing that they found is, workers are 70% of American workers, according to Gallup, are not engaged at work. And if you want to engage people at work, you got to give them meaningful work. And often a mission-driven, purpose-driven company that has a dual purpose, like a benefit corporation, will give workers the meaning that they're looking for. Because today's workers, unlike my generation, which was, happy to get job security in exchange for working for a business that exists solely to maximize profit for shareholders. Well, this generation, working for a company that exists solely to maximize profit for shareholders, that's ultimately not enough meaning for somebody to get out of bed every morning and ride the Google bus from San Francisco to Mountain View. It's not going to cut it long term. So, that's what I'm looking for, is for some corporate leaders, and we don't need very many of them, to recognize that there is a better business model, better corporate form with a better business model waiting for us. And, my belief is that, it's just a matter of time before one of these leaders figures this out. And you know, I think like many disruptive technologies, once you get, you know, a handful of significant companies behind this way of doing business, the rest will follow.
I think that's a worthy model of change to pursue. And I hope for all of our sake that you're successful with it sooner rather than later.
Me too. Me too. Me too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, John, I could talk about this all day long with you. But I think for the sake of brevity, this seems like a good place to conclude. And you know what we'll do is I'd love to, we'll share either on a slide or in the blurb accompanying the video some information about you and where people can go to follow up with you about your work with Benefit Corps and with and in executive coaching and leadership and so forth.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'd just like to close with is I've started working as the executive producer for a full feature documentary film. The tentative title of which is A Better Party, Enlightened Capitalism, which will feature the global movement of business as a force for good. So if you're interested in being involved in that movie, you know, let me know.
Do I have to like audition like for a lead? Can I play like a lead actor type of role?
Well, you know, I think we'll probably need a narrator to, you know, so yeah. And you've got the proximity to Hollywood, so I think you've got the inside track, Francesco.
Am I finally going to get my big break? I've been waiting a long time.
We'll make you famous. Yeah, we'll make you famous. Yeah.
That sounds like a really interesting project. I'd love to hear more. So thanks again, John, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Francesco, for having me on the show.
You got it. Take care.